Kia ora. Kia tīmata tātou. Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai ki tēnei hui me tēnei kaupapa o te rā. Kei te mihi au ki ngā tangata whenua o Aotearoa, ngā mihi nui, I aku rangatira, aku hoa mahi, e hoa māhau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. He Pākehā ahau, ko Pennyhagen Takawingoa. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar this morning with a bunch of amazing folks that have helped to organise this work. So hosted by the Centre for Public Impact and co-organised with ourselves at the Co-design Lab, the Southern Initiative in Inspiring Communities. So just wanting to welcome everybody. And before I hand over for Angie to formally open for us, I have the responsibility of just pointing out some of the tech norms that CPI utilised for these sessions. Firstly, just to note that this is being recorded and people are excited about that because there's a whole bunch of people that really wanted to be here and can't. So apparently that's also why we should have our videos off so that your cat doesn't get famous this morning. But up to you guys, but that's one of their asks here. Obviously on mute would be great. Jump in, introduce yourself in comments or and put questions in chats as we go through, and we'll be circulating the things that come up and that get captured in the chat anonymously after. Please use the hashtag Human Learning Systems if you want to share about this online. So I'll be back to just share a little bit about the structure of the session in a minute. I just want to hand the rako over to my colleague Angie Tanari to open for us. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora tātou. I'm going to open our space with a traditional blessing, and then I would like to acknowledge all of those online and around the world. So, inui tātou, tūtaua mai I runga, tūtaua mai I raro, tūtaua mai I roto, tūtaua mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mauretu, te mauri ora ki te katoa, haumi e hui e tae ki e. I'm drawing from above, I'm drawing from below, from within, from our environment, vitality and well-being for all to be strengthened in unity today. Nō reira, he mihi nui kia tātou katoa, tuatahi me mihi au ki ngā tangata o te whenua moimoia. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of the Moimua of Australia, their continuing connection to land, water, community, and their elders, past, present and emerging. Me mihi au hoki ki ngā whanaunga te moana nui a kiwa, ki a koutou, ngā tuakana, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei wāhi, ki tēnei kōrero whakawhitiwhiti, kia tātou aku rangatira o te ao, tēnei te mihi, tēnei te aroha ki a tātou, nau mai haere mai, mō tēnei wānanga he kōrero pai mō ngā oranga ngā whānau, whānui o te ao. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd just like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia. I'd like to acknowledge our tuakana or our elder siblings in the Pacific, and all of our speakers and those that have gathered today, our leaders in this space, to be able to have this amazing opportunity to kōrero together, to talk, to have a conversation in space about how we best support our families for better outcomes. Kia ora, Penny.
Kia ora, Angie, aku mihi ki a koe. So I've just got the privilege of being the timekeeper and the shuffler today. And before I hand back to Angie and Anna Jane to start with the first session, I just want to acknowledge the context of this conversation at a really intense and challenging time, especially in Tamaki Makaurau, but all around the world, and just acknowledge people's presence here this morning and wherever else they may need to be at the same time, and how much people are working hard in different ways to keep whānau and communities safe and connected, and navigate ourselves through what is really a truly complex context. I just want to also really thank all the fellow learners that are on this call. So everybody here is part of what is an ongoing conversation in Aotearoa and worldwide about how we do public service here, what it actually means. And there's a lot of living examples of us learning some quick lessons right now about things like power sharing and actually how we can be together differently. So I know everyone here is bringing their own experiences and part of a bigger journey taking place in Aotearoa, specifically around what it means to be treaty partners, to realise the aspirations of Te Tiriti, to understand what it means to work in the context of ongoing colonisation, structural racism, but also the importance and significance of place and understanding those things. And so it's really exciting for us to host this conversation with Toby about human learning systems and how that connects to the context here on Aotearoa, but also ground this conversation in what's already here in the context of our place and history of place and the knowledge systems and the understanding of navigating complexity and innovation that already exists within Te Ao Māori, Tikanga Māori, Mātauranga Māori, and also within our wider Pacific connected but unique knowledge systems as well. So that's an opportunity for us to see what we can learn from HLS, but also what HLS can learn from the context of this place and what already occurs here in Aotearoa. So the way we're going to do the conversation today, this is a conversation that we could be in for weeks and months. So we've only got a short bit of time together. It's the beginning of, or a continuation of conversations that have been happening. And we hope to be able to convene more and host more and continue this in the new year. But we start with a kōrero from Angie and Anna Jane around Indigenous-led responses to complexity and kind of contextualising some of that within this place. Toby will take us through a bit of an intro to HLS and the connectivity perhaps to what's happening in the public service here. And then there's many examples of learning occurring already in Aotearoa, and we get to hear from one that's really situated in a local community learning context with inspiring communities. Depending on how we go, hopefully there's a conversation, a little opportunity to connect with some of the other fellow learners on the call. And then we'll just have some closing reflections from some awesome folks who are also on this journey and can provide their perspective, all as a lead into ongoing conversations. So I will hand over now to Angie and Anna Jane to ground us in that first conversation. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Penny, thank you for that. I just wonder if Anna wants to introduce yourself and first, and then we'll get on with the kōrero.
Kia ora. Sorry, I'm just trying to organise myself. You're probably seeing, here we go. The wrong screen, and I'm trying to figure out how I share the right screen for you, Angie, with the presentation, but nō reira. Mōrena tātou, ko Anna Jane Edwards tōku ingoa. Most people just call me Anna. I'm really privileged to lead the Uptempo team, which is a part of the Southern Initiative. And Angie, what can you see? Can you see the right screen with your slides?
Yeah, I can see the first one. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, AJ. Thanks for that, AJ. Sorry to throw it to you to introduce yourself as you were organising the tech side of it. Aroha mai. Kia ora tātou. Ko hekarangi te manga ko Waiputi awa ko Ngāti Parau te iwi nō reira te hei mauri ora he mahi mahana ki a tātou katoa. I'm Angie Tangari, I'm Ngāti Parau. My tribe is situated on the east coast of the North Island of Aotearoa. I'm born and bred South Auckland, and it's my privilege to work alongside some of these amazing people on screen in the Southern Initiative team and at the Co-design Lab, the Auckland Co-design Lab. Anna and I are really excited to be a part of this conversation, and we've got far too much to share with you today. But what we would like to share with you is a conceptual frame around Indigenous-led responses to complexity, innovation and transformation, and how we see our Indigenous knowledge systems as being incredibly powerful tools for learning and innovation. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm certainly not an expert, And AJ's too humble to say that. Anna's too humble to say that she is an she'd say she isn't one, but she is one. But what we are incredibly privileged to do is to be able to draw on some amazing Indigenous academic work and some incredible wisdoms from our people, our elders, and our tupunas, our ancestors, and that is what we're trying to bring to our work. So what we have between the two of us is some experience of working in innovation, learning and change, and developing and evolving an Indigenous practice and conceptual framework for that. And that's what we'd like to share with you today. Can we go to the next slide, Anna? And the way that I would like to frame that is that based on some really interesting comments from Professor Rangi Mātamua just recently in the context of our Indigenous knowledge system here in Aotearoa, Mateiranga Māori, being challenged as not being one based on science. And I just think that's a really interesting way to ground the conversation in the context of how our Indigenous knowledge system is viewed, how it is legitimised or not legitimised or not validated by post-colonial ideology system. So the things I'd like to talk into, and then Anna's going to give us an example, is how our knowledge systems are actually indeed premised on scientific foundations, and also how the cultural value system that underpins it and holds it, our values, our principles, our customary practices, are the superpower to help us to start to do things differently, and to innovate and learn in innovation for transformation. Can we go to the next slide, AJ? So it's probably it's a lot of words here, but what Professor Rangi Mātamua talked about recently is that you do not navigate the oceans that our people did, the people of the Pacific, our Pacific cousins. You don't navigate those, you don't transverse those horizons based on myth and legend. You do, however, transverse those oceans based on very disciplined observation, learning loops, testing, evidencing, and folding that learning and evidence into your knowledge system. So I've heard people talk about the navigation and the pioneering of the oceans and the time our people did it. It's synonymous to space travel. And so the first point is that as a knowledge system, it is based on some incredible learning, innovation, evidencing, and application of evidence systems and ways of being that are values based. So next slide, please, AJ. The second part that's really important to me is that what Professor Rangi Mātamua also said was often our knowledge system is rejected as being scientific because of it's underpinned and closely connected to our cultural values. And what we would argue, Anna and I would argue, and many of the practitioners in our team at the Southern Initiative and with the lab, what we argue is that these are indeed our superpowers. And these are our superpowers, our cultural values are our superpowers because they reorientate us towards relationship, space, and towards a different set of values and what matters and what should be valuable from the perspective of whānau and from a culturally appropriate lens. So I'm just going to talk into some of those concepts and then Anna's going to give you an example of how that guides us in our innovation work in South Auckland. If we go to the next one, Anna, I think it's is there one? Yeah, that's the one. Cool. Thanks, Anna. The starting place for when I think about an Indigenous-led methodology and practice, a starting place for me is to think about mana motuhake. And this is important because the starting place is an affirmation of our place as Māori in Aotearoa, and our right to be practicing our customary values system, principles, and practices, customary practices. What's important about this is that becomes our starting point, that we're not, because in the past we've been trying to work towards that. And for me, the important thing is to start with. We have a celestial, our tupuna, our ancestors gave us this amazing opportunity to be here on the planet and draw from the environment as our mother, as our father, and be connected to the environment as we are to each other, and to do so to stand in the identity of who we are as a people, and our cultural identity. And so that's why I'm so excited to be able to talk into our indigenous knowledge systems as an innovation methodology, as a learning methodology, as connected to this place and as relevant to this place and the story of our people here in Aotearoa. Could you go to the next one, AJ? The second principle, whanaungatanga, is really about acknowledging our connection to each other as human beings, but our connection to the environment, and our connection to this work as a calling, as a purpose for us, but that we view relationships as being a collective responsibility and accountability about how we care for each other. And what that helps us to think about is how you nurture those relationships with each other, how they are genuine, authentic, and that they're enduring. So that when we are connecting with families and each other, the end goal is that we have these relationships that support and nurture each other, and that are ongoing. The next one, Anna, please. Must be Mana. The second one, the third one is that we recognise the inherent power, potential, and influence of every being that we come into contact with. And what that means is that we need to respect their mana, their potential, their power and influence in all of the interactions that we have with each other, and in the way that we acknowledge the contribution of others in the work, families and communities, as they seek to design their own compelling alternatives for outcomes. And so we hold these three things, and this is not an exhaustive list of the principles and the values that we use, but we hold these things as a way of being in the work. And if you go to the next slide, and I think it's a little bit of a round off, and then you can give us an example. And what taking a cultural values approach, or a cultural lens approach to the methodology and practice for learning and innovation helps us to do is it helps to reorientate from what the current system status quo is, or the dominant ideology drives. So those three principles, for example, three values, they help us to start to focus on relationship and nurturing and caring for relationship, as opposed to transaction or intervention. They help us to focus on the conditions that we need to enable to grapple with complexity. Importantly, the space. When I talk about the space, what we're talking about is curating the ability to come into space, to be together, rather than to work into a program, a service delivery model, or a process. So thinking about what the spaces that we need to have for us to be safe to come into and be together and learn and innovate. And the last one is about sharing power, and what we're really interested in is collapsing the distance between those experiencing the most inequity in Aotearoa and the most centralised points of power in Aotearoa, and those are mostly held inside of our colonial institutions. So how are we collapsing the distance between those that are making the decisions towards those that can innovate for themselves? through their lived experience as being powerful. I'll hand it over to Anna now just to have a to share. Sorry, Anna, that was a lot of talking. To share an example of what that can look like.
All good. It's always awesome to hear you speak, Angie. And sorry, I should probably properly introduce myself. Kia ora ana tātou katoa. As I said, my name is Anna. I am a third generation Cook Islander, brought up in Tamaki Makaurau, but have a really strong connection back home to the Cooks where my parents and my husband's parents live. I'm really lucky to be able to lead a new initiative called Uptempo, which is an exciting opportunity to bring all of the work from across PSI together to create something new. And so we're a learning program which supports Pacifica to determine their own economic futures. And we kind of do that through focusing on growing intergenerational wealth and well-being through workforce progression. So for us, we're really focused on the long term. We're focused on supporting Ainga to determine what that future needs to look like. Our families have children within them under the age of 5, and that's really important for us because we know that that is where we can actually create the most long-term change. And just picking up on what Angie has been talking about in terms of moving from transactional to transformational, we take a whole of family approach rather than an individual approach. We are focused on building relationships between our ainga, between the organisations in which we work with, and across the system, rather than based on an individual service. And we take a tailored place-based approach, so not one size fits all. We're funded through MB and Peter McKenzie project, and we deliver Uptempo in partnership with the Whono, a primary health organisation, and First Union, a trade union with about 30,000 members from across New Zealand. We work primarily in South and West Auckland, and we partner with a small number of ainga over the next 4 years to understand what those interactions with different parts of the system look like and test what those interactions need to look like to enable Pacifica to thrive, grow wealth and well-being. So I'm just going to talk really quickly about one example of what that looks like when you take when you put agency or mana motuhake at the centre, when you are te uleva, where you are creating the space and recognising that space between people and environment, and how we're looking at ways of sharing power across organisations to create the appropriate space for people to lead. So we have a range of different things that we're doing, testing, like we're doing stuff around driver's licensing, we're doing stuff with employers around what they need to do to attract, retain and progress Pacifica people. We're working with different agencies to support ainga, and all of that is quite messy, I guess. And what we're trying to do is look out for the tohu that tell us that something is changing for not only the people that are we're partnering with in terms of the ainga, but also the mental models that might be changing within institutions. What are the things that we are noticing about how that institution might be responding and then changing as a result of that. So we are working with Aotearoa Union and Stratcom, who's a private training establishment to support security workers to progress. Because what we're finding is that Pacifica make up 60% of the security workforce in Auckland, and they're predominantly at the lower end of that pay scale. And E2 have this amazing group of Pacifica members who are really keen to support each other to progress in the work and so leadership roles, but haven't necessarily had a good experience of the education system. So we are now looking at how you can set up a Pacifica network, member network within E2. So that will be the place that holds this work. What we need to do across Uptempo, E2 and Stratcom to provide the space for our members to create what that network looks like. And then supporting them to tell their stories about how they have succeeded in learning, how they've got their level 3 qualification, their tips and tricks about what it takes to actually go into a leadership role, how they've got pay increases, and how they can sustain that energy and group long term. What we've seen is we've had 10 people that have gone through the level 3 qualification so far. And as a result of that, each of them have got an $1.20 increase per hour straight after finishing that qualification, which only can, like at a minimum, will take about 2 weeks. So what we're looking to do is collapse the amount of time that it takes for people to grow income, have a great experience of learning, and then support each other to be able to do that in the natural spaces in which they are already in. And then feed that learning back into the spaces that it needs to be, so that we are recognising that you have to have a focus on supporting people to progress. So I'm going to leave it there. Pass it back to you, Angie, to close us off, and then hand it back to Penny. Kia ora.
I know we need to move on to respect others in this space. If you'll just pop up the Hotu Waka slide, Anna. Last thing from me is what Anna was talking about, is how do we lean in and start to observe and learn about new indicators, new ways of understanding what's important to families and communities. How do we cite those indicators, and how do we fold those things back into the system, and this amazing system of navigation, Hotu Waka. While it's described as a navigation system, it's also an incredibly powerful learning process and system for how do we understand, lean into, observe, evidence, test, learn, and fold that back into practice. But thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand it back to Penny, and I'm so looking forward to hearing the other speakers. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora korua. Thank you so much for that. So we're going to switch now to hand over to Toby, who's going to kōrero around the human learning system. But I just really want to acknowledge and appreciate that even though we've just got these little precious moments of time, that what Anna, Jane and Angie have done for us quickly is just create some context around some of the language and the nuance around relationships, values, and the care and the sophistication and nuance of some of those things, and the learning processes that are already in play and richly all around us here in Aotearoa. And so just really setting the scene for us. Thank you so much for doing that, both at a principles and kind of values and feeling, being, knowing, doing level, and then some really concrete examples of how that's coming to life in practice. So thank you. And I know that's an amazing kind of scene set for hearing Toby's interpretation of kind of a similar learning process, hey? So the similarities, the differences, and what we can learn from each other. So I'd hand over now to Toby Lowe, who's Visiting Professor of Public Management at the Centre for Public Impact and on secondment from the Newcastle Business School at Northumbria. And I know a lot of people have been following and getting a lot of value out of the work Toby's been doing on complexity, measurement and learning. So kia ora, Toby.
Thank you very much, Penny. And can I just say what a privilege it was to listen to Angie and Anna Jane then, because that was, I heard a bunch of incredible new stuff for me then, and I can already see how this stuff begins to fit together really, really nicely. So in some ways, what I'm going to share with you now is some applications of some of those kind of complexity informed principles in the world of public management. And I think I just kind of want to echo what I heard Angie say of you have an incredible resource to draw on here in navigating complexity and applying those things to how public management is done. Anyway, so what I want to share with you today comes from the explorations that we've done of how public management might work differently to better serve the strengths and needs of people across many different contexts. So one of the things I'm curious about is how is what we've learned about alternative forms of public management relevant in a Aotearoa New Zealand context? So that's kind of the question that I'm arriving with today. And what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is this idea of doing public management differently, about how the ideas that we've created in the UK, in Europe and other parts of the world have evolved from how public management is done currently in most places. I'm going to explore a little bit about why current approaches to public management fail. I'm going to talk then about what we've been able to develop as an alternative in our context, the human learning systems approach. And finally, then I'm going to hand over to the folks from the Good Sense programme to explore that as an example of human learning systems practice in an Aotearoa New Zealand context. So let's get into this. So I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of human learning systems in a UK context, and why is it that we've developed this alternative approach to public management. And essentially, the reason that we've developed this is as a response to the failings of new public management. And for those not familiar with the terminology, new public management is the language, is the name, the label of how public management is done in most parts of the Western world right now. So let's start with some definitions, make sure that that we all understand the terms that I'm using here, because they might well not be familiar to people. So public management is simply the discipline of how public service is planned and organised. And when I'm talking about public service, I'm talking about any purposeful work that supports human freedom and flourishing. So I want to get away from the idea, when I talk about this, I don't mean public service isn't a sector. So public service isn't just what government does. Public service is any purposeful work that supports human freedom and flourishing. And therefore there management is just the organisation of that work. So that's a bit about the terminology I'm going to use today. And there is a dominant way for how public management is currently done. It's got a name, it's called New Public Management. It was created in the 1980s, and it's kind of summed up but often by the 3 M's: markets, managers, and metrics. I won't dig into the detail of that here, but one way to summarize it is that the idea that government should be run like a business, but like a business was run in 1985. And so one of the challenges with the way that new public management has been done as a way to organise public service is that it just doesn't work very well. So I've been speaking to a bunch of people in your context about the different failings that it exhibits. It exhibits those failings everywhere. So there's a quote here on the top of the page from Christopher Hood, who is probably the most preeminent public management scholar in the world. He pulled together 3 decades of research on what happens when governments implement new public management reform. So when they turn public service into markets, managers, and metrics, it was supposed to create a government that works better and costs less. What do we have to show for 3 decades of new public management reforms? Short answer: higher costs and more complaints. So this stuff fails for you, it fails everywhere. And when you dig into the research of some of the key underpinning practices of new public management, we can begin to see further evidence of these failings. So setting targets and managing public service according to targets is a key plank of new public management. That's the metrics bit, right? But when a systematic review of research into whenever target-based performance management systems are enacted or implemented, 80% of those studies found evidence of gaming, of people deliberately manipulating data to make it look good. And nearly 3/4 found evidence of people deliberately lying. So when people do research about how target-based management systems really work, what they find is that whenever you have an organization dominated by targets, what you find is people making stuff up. So kind of our summary of this is that new public management creates a kind of simplified fantasy world in which the abstractions of data points substitute for the complex reality of life. So what we've seen when we've kind of talked with people doing this stuff is that they're creating performance data, they're using performance data that is routinely gamed. You've got people writing plans that they know won't happen. You've got people creating budgets that they know don't reflect reality. And worst of all, it treats the people that we serve as data points, not as full human beings. So that's a little bit about the kind of evidence showing that new public management fails, and fails in all the contexts in which it operates. So question then, why does it fail? Well, our analysis suggests that it fails because it pretends that the creation of public service outcomes is simple and linear. If you do this, then that will happen. When in reality, creating outcomes in people's lives is complex. What do I mean by that? This is a systems map of the outcome of obesity. So it's what happens when you shut a bunch of public health experts in a room together and say, you're not allowed out until you've mapped all the causes of obesity and all the relationships between all of those causes. So this was produced by the UK Government Office for Science in 2007, I think. And what it shows is that the outcome of obesity, like any outcome in the world, is the product of hundreds of different factors all working together. So that they say, you can't see the 100 different factors on this diagram, they're too small, but you can see them lumped together in areas like macroeconomic drivers, education, media, technology, the nature of work, the built environment, people's early life experiences, how food production and supply works, healthcare and treatment options. All of these things work together in people's lives to create the outcome of obesity or its absence, right? So contrast this with how public management suggests that outcomes are created. This is from the textbooks about how to think about outcomes from a public management process, from a public management perspective. If you have the right inputs, people and other resources that organizations have, and those people run a program process, they do the thing they're supposed to do, that will create outcomes, the outputs that will create outcomes, and that will create longer term outcomes. This is a simple and linear process. This is how people imagine that outcomes are made. But to imagine that outcomes are made like this is pretending. It is simply not real, because this is the reality of how an outcome is made in the world. So if we plan our public service like this, we are planning based on pretending. It's not connected to the reality of how the world works. So little wonder that it goes wrong. So what we've seen a whole range of people doing is trying to escape this idea of the A to B linear management, that if we do A, then B will definitely happen. So we just got to plan for A and B will definitely happen. That is not how the world works. If we care about real outcomes in people's lives, we need to open the door to the complexity of the real world, like this person is showing us. So essentially, the message that we found in the context in the UK and other places where we've been developing this is, if we want real outcomes in people's lives, we need a different way of doing public management. So if you care about achieving real outcomes in a cost-effective way, you can choose to do public management differently. You don't have to do the new public management markets managers metrics, which we know fails in a variety of contexts. So this is the work we've been doing. So if we know new public management fails, what does the alternative look like? So we've been working with a number of different organizations over the past kind of 5 years or so to help people develop from the ground up what an alternative looks like. And we call that alternative approach human learning systems. And we released this into in a free ebook back in June called Public Service for the Real World. And so in some respects, we feel like we know what an alternative approach to public management looks like in a kind of UK and other European context, because we've seen people do it. So we know that it is possible to do public management differently. So it's just a choice. You can choose to do it in a new public management way, or you can choose to do it differently. Because we've seen now 48 case studies of human learning systems in practice. 29 were specifically created for that report, and from as diverse sources from local voluntary sector organisations through to national governments. Now, our knowledge around this is incomplete. It's probably always incomplete, because whenever people start to use the human learning systems principles in a different context, there is more to know. So one of the things I'm curious about is, given that there's such a interesting interconnection between kind of indigenous principles of an understanding of complexity and the principles underpinning human learning systems, what might this look like in an Aotearoa New Zealand context? So now what I'm going to do now is just kind of outline what the kind of headline principles are. So I think you'll begin to see some of the connections with what Angie and Anna Jane were sharing before. So what's the human bit of human learning systems? Well, this speaks to the fundamental beliefs of human learning systems. So first one was the one that I kind of articulated before, that the purpose of public service is to promote human freedom and flourishing. Right? And the second underpinning belief is to understand a human being is to see them in the complex web of relationships that is their lives. And this is where I think the kind of relational aspect, I had such a big grin on my face when Angie was talking about this before. This is about people's essential interdependence, people's essential connection with the people around them and with the planet as a whole. And we think that these beliefs have consequences for how public management is done. So if we believe that the purpose of public service is to promote human freedom and flourishing, then it says that only we have the right to determine outcomes in our lives. No one has the right to say what good well-being looks like in my life except me, right? With obviously caveats about capacity around children and potentially some others, but as a principle it stands. Only I have the right to determine what a good outcome in my life looks like. No one has the right to tell me what that looks like. And secondly, the consequence is that if we understand people in the complex web of relationships their lives, then we need to understand that outcomes are created by all the actors and factors in my life. All the connections and all the relationships in my life is what creates an outcome in my life. And that has a radical consequence for how we think about public service. So if we think about it, it means people doing a human learning systems approach to public service think about a person's life as this kind of complex system that can produce a desired outcome or not. So this is a kind of representation of the outcome of well-being in someone's life. So down the left-hand side, we've represented this as a solar system, as just a way to think about kind of a set of relationships. And at the center of this solar system is the person themselves, and then other actors in their system that help create the well-being or not is their family and friends, organizations responsible for public and green spaces, cultural provision, neighborhood places, welfare and benefit agencies, health services. You get the picture of all of these people and organizations contribute to whether well-being exists in someone's life or not. And down the right-hand side, there are a bunch of kind of structural factors in that person's life that bash into all of these actors and change the pattern of results. So their income and wealth, their employment status, their health status, their ability to exercise agency, their ability to participate in democratic process, their relationships to the dominant cultures in the world. All of these structural factors interact with the actors to produce a pattern of results that we call well-being or its absence. So that's the human bit of human learning systems. What have we found about learning? Well, effectively, what we found is that if you want to help create outcomes in each person's unique life as a complex system, then learning is the management strategy for public service. So what do I mean by learning is the management strategy? Well, okay. Let's go back to this idea that creating an outcome is complex. We know that creating an outcome is complex because each person's life is different. So there are a different set of actors and factors in my life than there are in yours. What counts as an outcome in my life is different than for yours. So what counts as well-being for me is different than what counts as well-being for you. And the way that outcome is made is different in my life than in your life. And also, all of this stuff changes over time. So well-being in my life as a near 50-year-old is different from my life, well-being in my life as a 20-year-old. Right? And all of this stuff is changing all the time. So creating outcomes is complex. let's translate this into a kind of public service strategy, make this a bit real. So what does it mean for a public service worker to help someone who is experiencing chronic pain? So say I'm a public service worker and I'm supporting you as a person who experiences chronic pain in your life. So don't know if you know this, but chronic pain is pain that doesn't have a particular corresponding physical injury. So there's nothing for a doctor to fix and to take your pain away. So if I'm a public service worker and using learning as my strategy, the first thing that I do is I want to understand your life as a system that currently produces the outcome of chronic pain. So we can reveal your life as a system to me and to you. So I might ask you questions like, do you experience the pain more in the evening or in the mornings? Do you experience it more at work or when you're at home? Do you experience it when you eat these particular foods or that particular food? Do you experience it when you make this particular action or that particular action? And slowly we will build up a picture of your life as a complex system that currently produces the outcome of chronic pain. And then what we'll do together is we'll design a series of things to try in your life, can call them experiments, call them explorations, to see whether we can get your life as a complex system to produce a different pattern of results, a different outcome. So what happens if we try fitting this piece of equipment into your home? What happens if we try this physiotherapy manipulation? What happens if you try this diet rather than that diet? What happens if you try joining this walking group? And together we'll run all of these experiments and explorations in your life and see what makes a difference to that pattern of results that is your life. And then we'll take the results of all of those and we'll embed those as behavior change in your life and as structural change in the things around you. And it's by seeing that public service relationship as a learning relationship that public service is able to produce a bespoke response for each and every person. And this is like connecting to what I heard Angie and Anna talk about in terms of enabling each person to innovate in their own life, right? Because each person's life matters and is unique to them. So human learning systems. And again, when I was listening to Angie, like I heard what I suddenly realized is when I talk about system, there's it's the different language, but the same, I think, similar underpinning ideas to that idea of intense relationality that I heard you talk about, Angie. So a system is just a way of describing a set of relationships in the world that combine to make something happen. And so when we talk about systems in human learning systems, we just mean the set of relationships which create a desired outcome or its absence. So when I speak the language of systems, when people who use the idea of human learning systems speak the language of systems, what we mean is the set of relationships in the world that combine to create a desired outcome. And when we look at systems in this way, we realize that all of our life is systems. So let's not talk about the system as being something out there. Our life is a system. We are part of these systems, but we view systems at different system scales. So a person's life is a system, as we've explored. An organization is a system. A place is a system, and a country or region is a system. These are all systems, right? Because there's all different sets of relationships at different scales. And then applying this idea to public management, what we see is we take this idea of the learning cycle that I'm doing as a public-facing worker speaking to you, and we're connecting the learning cycle that I do at this kind of smaller scale with the learning cycle of organizations. So what an organization might ask is they might ask learning questions. How do we learn from all the learning cycles of all the different people that we serve? And the management of that organization asks enabling questions as part of their learning cycle. So they'll ask questions like, what are the maximum caseloads for workers to enable them to do those learning cycles? What information systems do we need to share the results of those experiments across all the people in the organization? What shared reflective spaces do we need as an organization in order that people can learn from each other? What staff capabilities do we need in order to recruit for and train people who can do these kind of learning relationships? These are the learning cycles that happen at the management level in organizations. So we're connecting learning cycles at different system scales with learning from and enabling relationships. And what we've seen then is that places and countries that operate this kind of human learning systems approach, what they're doing is creating these learning from and enabling relationships across all of these different system scales, building up from the bottom, from the person's life system, through to an organization, place, and country. So that's a daftly quick dash through the idea of a human learning systems approach. And we call it public service for the real world because it starts with the reality of how outcomes are made. So if you care about the reality of how outcomes are made, not the pretendy data that's created in a new public management system, this is a good place to start. It means that people adopt learning as the management strategy. So essentially, as a leader, your primary task is to create learning environments. So if you're following an HLS approach, what your job is as a leader or manager is to create learning environments. And this strategy can be applied at all system scales, a person, organization, place, and country and region. And I'm not going to lie to you, the people and places that have done this in the UK and other places, it's a ton of work to create this kind of shift in how public management works, because you've got to upend a whole set of established conventions for what the task of management is. So that's a ton of work to change, but the payoff for that work that people have found is better outcomes for less money. And this is a bit of a holy grail in public service, right? Better outcomes, less money. And what they've found with this is that the essence of this better outcomes with less money is because it's happier people. So happier residents and citizens because they're getting the bespoke service that they need, but happier public service workers because they're liberated to do the jobs that they joined public service to do. So if that is interesting or relevant in an Aotearoa New Zealand context at all, then you can see more at the humanlearning.systems website or the realworld.report, which is the kind of microsite for the thing that we launched in June. And now it's my absolute pleasure to pass over to the amazing folk in Inspiring Communities and the Good Sense project, who are going to talk you through an example of a human learning systems approach in the place where you are. Thanks very much.
Morena koutou. It's great to be part of this this conversation this morning. I'm David, part of the team in Wesley Community Action and part of the team of Inspiring Communities.
Talo Falaka, my name is Ruth Nonu and I am an ex-participant of Good Sense and currently co-facilitator for Good Sense.
I just want to start with a couple of mihis to people. Mihi to kia koroa, Ange and Anna for creating the container for this conversation. To Miki, for Toby for taking that and also embellishing that from a global perspective. And I also want to mihi to Makareta Makapalo, who was supposed to be sitting here, but her mother's in her final phase, and Makareta's at home with mum, caring for her mother. So I was sort of thinking as Toby was talking, that's a reminder about human systems. We just adapt and change. We planned for 3 of us here, got the phone call last night, her mum's fading, Makareta's where she needs to be. So it's that level of agility and change. We're really excited to share a little bit about the story about Good Sense. And this is a story that sits within a whole system. So I'm going to share the bit that Makareta was going to share now. Then I'm going to pass over to Ruth to talk about some of her journey, and then I'll pull it back together. So Good Sense starts in the community called Cannons Creek, which is in Pororua East. That's a community that most government agencies define as low income, high need, and all those other sorts of deficit sort of language. It's a community that we use other language to describe, and the people who live in the community also use very different language to describe. And the genesis for the Good Sense story came out of a conversation about our food bank and increasing demand for our food bank at a time when the economy was supposedly going really well. That started an inquiry, a learning question. Why is that happening? A group of Pacific women gathered together to say, well, we're up for that conversation. And in that conversation, at first, there was a lot of silence and a lot of awkwardness. And it took one courageous woman to sort of actually voice her reality, which was around high interest debt in low income households. And that was sort of like the floodgates. Whoosh, out it all came. And in that group, initially, the phase was the emotional response was anger. How dare these third tier lenders rip us off with exorbitant interest rates? And, you know, I was getting proposals about throwing bricks through windows and graffitiing and all that sort of stuff that happens when you feel ripped off by the system. But then over time, and through partnership with inspiring communities and their emerging community-led development approach, we started to do a process of learning and reflection about the whole system that supports this cycle of people being in chronic debt. And, you know, we talked with a whole range of people in that system. We went and talked to senior bank managers. That they told us that the people who were in good sense are what they call high touch people, and they can't make any money out of them. So they loan money to the third tier lenders so they can make money out of them. So we realized it's just actually one big system. And we talked and we gathered all those people together, people, whānau who were in debt, bank managers, ministers of the church, young people in the community. And the mural, the picture behind us, that's our theory of change. And that was drawn during the community conversation about trying to understand the cycle of debt that sucks wealth out of communities like Cannons Creek and Purutua East. So lots of learning, lots of insights. And what we developed over time with the community was, I guess you'd call it like a course, but it's not like a course in the traditional sense of a program, where people would come together from the community, create a safe space to have a learning conversation about their financial situation. And in that, we use this tool called PCOMS, Partners for Change Outcome Management System, a very powerful tool. It's so powerful because that each participant measures their own journey and what's change is happening for them. And then collectively and individually, they make sense about that themselves. And so what it does is it draws all the knowledge out of that exists within the room, rather than a lot of financial programs where the assumed knowledge sits with the tutor or the teacher up the front, who's imparting all this expertise with passive participants in the room. But that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Ruth to say a little bit about her story in the Good Sense approach.
So 3 years ago, I found myself in debt, a huge amount of debt. I was robbing Peter to pay Paul. I was unable to put food on the table for my 2 children and myself. I was living pay week to pay week. And being broke really affected my well-being. So I came across Good Sense, and I actually went through the course twice. The first time round was really difficult for me. I just didn't have enough clarity around my finances. But the second time round, the penny dropped, and I was just able to save money, which has been really hard to do. And just used all the tools that was given to me through Good Sense. I found the group discussions really helpful. A lot of the participants in the group made the environment really safe, and it was a non-judgmental area to share our finances and some of the problems that we were having. The second time round really triggered a huge change in my finances that I was able to save. I was asked to co-facilitate, so now I've been co-facilitating for almost a year. I'm 2 years debt-free. I've been involved with the savings pool and the veggie co-op, which is also run through Wesley, and that's been beneficial to me financially. Things that I've learnt on this journey, as a co-facilitator, my story is really relatable to a lot of our participants. So they're willing to open up and look at the tools openly and get really real with their own finances. I also learnt that it's only I can fix my finances, but the tools that are given via Good Sense really empowered me to do that. So now as a co-facilitator, I also acknowledge that people that are in debt, they carry a lot of shame and a heavy burden. And I just want them to realise that they're not alone and that my story is relatable.
Sure, Ruth. So there's something happening in this process. And as we went on this journey of discovery around Good Sense, we didn't have a roadmap. It was a process of discovery. And we actually had to do a lot of unlearning and relearning. Because an organisation like Wesley Community Action and other organisations out there that are sort of set up to fix people that are broken, we realised that a lot of that mindset was actually pretty toxic. In fact, there's a really big risk that out of our desire to help people, we actually perpetuate colonising models. We actually think we've got the answer to their problem. And if we get that government contract to run that service, and as it's defined in the project specs, somehow something's going to happen that's going to fix them. Well, as Toby talked about the data about gaming the system, under that colonising approach, everyone's just gaming the system. And the participants are basically just operating how they need to function. They've learned to function in those groups without having the hard, challenging, grunty learning conversations that are essential to trigger change in any level. So we've had to do a lot of unlearnings. We've gone down dead ends. We've sort of thought we had the solution. It's been messy. It's been untidy. We've had some philanthropic trusts, the Todd Foundation, that stuck in there when we sort of didn't know what was happening. So that's been really appreciated. We've also had a relationship with the public departments and government departments during the way. And it'd be fair to sort of say there's been some, a range of responses, some creative tension at times when government was really wanting to redo the budgeting process. They acknowledged that they hoovered up a lot of the IP that had gained out of this community in Good Sense. And we shared it freely because this is knowledge that should be shared. But somehow in that transactional process, something happened to that knowledge that it sort of became compartmentalized and stuck into the model, the old model that Toby talked about, that somehow gutted the very magic that happens in a relational, rich and safe environment. So there's lots of learnings we need to have with them. And we've talked with so many consultants and contractors that have been sent here to talk to us and interview us about stuff. And to be honest, we don't know what the value is of that other than is some report. And we seldom get even copies of the report. So lots of learning there. And as Ruth sort of said, this mindset shift that we went on, it triggered a whole flourishing of other stuff. The savings and loans pool that's sort of grown here in the community where people are saving and loaning to each other, and the fruit and veggie co-op, what happens. So they're actually, I think it's about that mana motahake, you know, that Angie and Anna talked about. These are initiatives that the community and the local people own and drive and operate. It's them being active and part of creating well-being for their own whānau, for their own hapori and community. So that's a little bit about the story of Good Sense. We're excited and find it really refreshing to read about the human learning approach, because we just saw it's so easy to stack up the story of Good Sense, aligning with what Toby's outlined in terms of the human learning thing. We also think it really fits with our whole kaupapa Te Tiriti commitment and around indigenous knowledge and the ways of understanding the world in which we inhabit now. So ko mutu toko koro, kia pini.
Kia ora, o ngā mihi nui kia Korua, and thanks David and Ruth, and especially really appreciate Ruth your sharing from your own experience this morning. Lots of comments in the chat about how powerful that was, and just mahi to you and your journey and what you're offering, both of you there. So thank you so much. I'm sure people can appreciate the challenge that we've had to figure out how do we fit all this in 90 minutes, and we almost can't. I know there's lots of things that have already gone unsaid, and so many threads to pick up on. So just again, signaling that we'll try and do that in future conversations. What we'd really like to do now is just offer just a little bit of space for connecting for some others that are on the call, or if you just need to sit for 5 minutes, it's not no obligation to join the breakout, but it is an opportunity for 10 minutes to just have a conversation or connect with some others, so you don't feel, especially for those of us in Tamaki who are still sitting on our own in our various work from home places or wherever we are, just to connect in and say hello and have a chat about what you've heard. We'd love you to capture some notes about what's come up, put them in the chat. There's already been some great questions and connections raised. So if you just need 5 minutes to process or grab a hot drink, kei te pai, but if you can jump in the breakouts and just connect in, introduce yourself, have a kōrero around some of the things that have come up. If someone can take a few notes, and then when we come back together, drop them in the chat, and that helps us gather together what's resonating and coming up for people. So I think, is that all I need to say, David? You'll do a little magic thing and we'll come back in about 10 minutes. Kia ora.
That's right. So breakout rooms are now open. If you click join, if you'd like to join, you can enter your breakout room, and not now if you want to grab a tea, as Penny said.
Oh, kia ora. No mai hoki mai. Welcome back, everybody. I can never tell what's going on with the breakout groups, but hopefully either you had an awesome conversation, a cup of tea, or if you ended up in a room by yourself, it was a gift of just a few moments silence. It would be awesome if people could drop a summary or some thoughts or reflections into the chat from what came up in your group, including things that you would love to be able to explore further with others. So if people can just take a moment to drop things into the chat that came out in the conversation, that would be great. Sounds like quite a few people had some quite powerful reflections and connections even in that short period of time. What we're going to do just for our remaining 10 minutes is hear from what we describe as a keynote listener. So Dickie Humphreys, who's joining us and is head of social impact at Auckland Council, but can also introduce himself, to do just a reflection from his perspective and position on what he's heard, the potential, and any gems that often Dickie is likely to share with us. So I just welcome him for just to spend a few minutes reflecting back what he's heard and sees out of this kōrero from his perspective. And then apart from needing to make sure that I thank everybody, I'll be handing it back to Anna, Jane and Angie just for their own reflections and closing for us. So kia ora, Dickie, welcome.
Kia ora, thanks Penny. Kia rana tātou katoa toa, te roa mā te otua. Tēnā tātou katoa, ko Dickie Humphreys tōku ingoa, ko te Head of Community Impact, te roto e te kaunihera o Tāmaki Makaurau. Wow. A big mihi to everyone who has shared such deep intelligence and wisdom and experiences from what seems like 3 very interconnected and overlapping realms. So I've taken some notes. I was said, could you be a keynote listener? I thought, oh, that's easier than being a keynote speaker, and it's actually not. Because I'm like, oh yes, well, where are the gems? How are they popping up? So I've got a myriad of notes here. Of course, lockdown 10 weeks means you run out of paper, so it's literally on the inside of muesli boxes. But we'll get there, whānau, we'll get there. So things that came to me in the first part there by Angie and Anna. You know, this idea that our indigenous knowledge systems, our mātauranga, is premised on science, but also interwoven and infused with our superpowers that come from our cultural worldview. And the idea that the colonial worldview dismisses that wholesale, right? And my kind of insight that I'm kind of hearing in here is what is maybe unsaid, or at least between the lines that I'm picking up, is that, you know, that our mātauranga or our indigenous knowledge systems may seem to be dismissed from a place of ignorance and arrogance, but underpinning that, my belief is that it's actually dismissed from a place of fear, that the colonial worldview is scared of our superpowers, right? They're scared of our superpowers of whanaungatanga, mana, and reciprocity, because it sits at odds and it undermines the superpowers of the colonial system, which is about institutional power, as opposed to whanaungatanga, which is about, their superpowers are about superiority as opposed to reciprocity. And that their superpowers, or the colonial superpower, is about individualized transaction as opposed to transformation and being in relationship of reciprocity, of being in whanaungatanga. So I think it can be sometimes quite easy to dismiss when our stuff gets dismissed as like, oh, well, they're just arrogant, they don't know anything. But also I think it could be insightful to see it as a place that comes from a place of fear, and that might offer us some ways in to how we create changes in those spaces if we understand it from where it's coming from. While also saying that, yeah, it's also ignorant and arrogant, but there's also fear in there as well. Alternative forms of public management. This was interesting. It described a lot of my working life, and I was laughing along thinking, oh my gosh, geez, this is totally where we're stuck. But a couple of things to add. Toby said, gave a whole bunch of reasons why new public management has failed. And I'll just offer up two more, right? To link in some of the kōrero from Anna and Angie. And where public service or public management of public service is centered on the idea of that it supports human flourishing. Yes, no one turns up to work trying to make that idea worse off. But from our indigenous cosmogonies, we understand that the human experience is not at the center of the cosmos. It is a result of the cosmos, right? So that then means that human flourishing is not human flourishing anake. It's not only human flourishing. And Toby then talks about this further on as he starts to unpack the system stuff. But our relationship to the created world, our relationship to Taiao, our relationship to each other, to space, to time, to all these factors of the cosmos, doesn't have us at the center. Doesn't the indigenous world does not place us at the center of it. And so I would kind of also premise that some of the failure is also that we can quite often forget or become have our blinders on to that integrated nature of the human experience in the context of all things. If you want to really get out there. The other thing for failure would raise is this great point around targets and metrics that Toby raises, that we get these targets and metrics and, oh no, we have to measure our self-worth and our value against this indicator, this indicator, this indicator. And the point that Toby makes is that a lot of that is based on lies. Like, it's not real, it's a pretense. I would also add to that the metrics and the indicators that we create as institutions are often important to the institution, right? So as an organization, we have all these metrics, but who are they important to? They're important to our accountants. They're important to our human resource metrics. They're important to all our internal mechanisms. Very rarely do I ever see a metric that is important to whānau. So we measure things that are important to us as an institution, as opposed to measuring things that are important to whānau. Like I've got a whole bunch of internal metrics, which I won't reveal here, but I'm like, whānau don't care about that. Whānau don't care how many X, Y, Z. Whānau don't care about that. Whānau don't care about that. But all right, let's figure out how to bring some balance to that. But I love Toby's point that ultimately there's a lot of lying that is all predicated on. And I would say that, you know, if I come back to the cosmological view, you know, that it is eco, not ego, that's at the center of all of this. That's ultimately, that's the lie. You know, that's the lie that the metrics that are based on, in my opinion, right? Is this this blindness that we have to the reality of the human experience in relation to everything, to all things. If I move now to the inside of the breakfast packets, yeah, so we've got broken down human, learning, and systems. So human, just a couple of points there. Picking up the connections through to indigenous worldviews. This is about our complexity in the wā. So we understand the wā from our moana nui worldviews as where the relational space occurs. It's also informed by time, place, and relationships. And so that complexity of human relationships, we already have a concept of this in there. When we invest in a relationship, we actually are investing in the space and the time around that and the complexities of the relationships around that. But that also flows into the next point around learning, right? So the learning point there raised by Toby with the concept of wā also extends into learning systems. So we have the words wānanga in the Kokarans or wānanga in Te Ao Māori. And this is not a transactional teaching method where the person with the knowledge turns up and the other one consumes it in a linear fashion, goes off and lives their life. When we enter into wānanga or we enter into wānanga, we're entering into a relationship of learning. And that if we have learned elders or wisdom holders or people who have experiences other than my own that are inside of that wā, and we activate that knowledge, then we are in wānanga. So even so, the point around human systems and the point about learning processes from an indigenous worldview, there's a alignment there between those two. And then lastly, the one there about systems. So Toby rightly says that systems are a set of relationships in which outcomes are created. So this reminds me of the Te Reo Māori word ngahere, which is the word for forest, right? Ngahere, if you break that down, could also mean the many relationships. So, you know, ngahere is the metaphor for ecology, for many different bits of a forest that have a integrated and interrelated relationship with each other. That both the ngahere, the thing, the forest, but also ngahere, the many relationships, operating as an ecology, which brings us right back to what Angie and Anna were saying. Then we heard these beautiful examples from our whānau, a good sense, which really made it all kind of land, right? So it's something tangible here. And I love the insights that were raised about having to unlearn and relearn. And if I come back to what was raised initially in the voyaging stories and that our mātauranga is premised on science, that there's a whole lot of unlearning that needs to happen because we are immersed in a colonial worldview, right? And sometimes we can't really tell the difference between what we're in and what is me. And so this unlearning and relearning, yeah, I see that as like a resourcing as well, right? So we're always talking about resourcing in an institution, but there's actually an opportunity here to resource, to come back to the source knowledge, to come back to the source knowledge of this land, of this region, and to then be resourced by that.
Dickie.
And that last part there around, they never could capture the magic. once an external central government agency came and said, oh, that's a great idea, let's package that up and put it into the boxes that we know don't work. And then scratch their heads as to where was the magic? Well, we don't have the magic anymore. And obviously that was devoid of the superpowers named by Angie and Anna at the beginning. So those are my thoughts.
Oh,
Kia ora, thank you so much, Dickie. Hand over to you, Ange, to wrap up, and there'll be lots of ways to reconnect into this kōrero whānau. We'll send it out. Thank you, Angie.
Thank you very much, Dickie. I mean, I vote that Dickie's the keynote speaker at the next one. That was pretty amazing. I did have some reflections, but I want to respect the space and close us. So I'd just like to thank Anna, Dickie, Ruth, David, and Toby for sharing and their wisdom today. And I want to thank Thea and David in the background for making this happen, and also Penny, who always has this incredible way of landing us into some very, very complex conversations with people who want to say a lot of things and go over time. Thank you, Penny. And I just want to say thank you, everybody, for taking out the time to share, and I look forward to the next conversation. Me noi tātou kia tau katoa, te ata whai o tātou ara ki a hikaraiti. Me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu ake. Ameni.
Kia ora.
Have a good day, whānau.
Kia ora. Thanks, everybody, for your time. Thanks, everyone that helped put it together. Kia ora, Angie.
Thank you all for your guys' time today. Ka kite.
Ka kite.